Okay. So hopefully everybody can see and hear me okay. I'm coming to you today to talk about estrogen and just kind of understanding what metabolism means and what that can add to your clinical practice. I'm going to go through some research today and also look through maybe some things you already know about metabolism and hope to add several things that maybe you don't know. And then we want to also look at the fun stuff, right? The treatment, how do we implement the testing and what that might look like for your patient population. Now, the reason that we are thinking about this lecture in general is that we have here statistics from the U.S. National Cancer Institute. We're thinking about, breast cancer specifically here. And if we look at this chart and we're thinking about, all the women in our lives, mom, sister, college roommate, neighbor, cousin, some sort of, family member, even your daughter. In that list that I have just said with the statistics here is that in a woman's lifetime, 1 in 8 will have a diagnosis of breast cancer. So it does actually affect a lot of people here. And I would say most females are scared of getting breast cancer and are nervous about even using things like estrogen replacement because of these things. And they've heard frightening things about it and its relation to cancer risk in general. And this is likely why. This is the Women's Health Initiative. We'll see that there were a large study, just under 30,000 women. And on May 31st, 2002, after about 5.2 years of the follow-up data and some safety monitor reporting, the board recommended stopping this trial, and that was the estrogen plus progestin versus placebo trial, because the test statistics for invasive breast cancer exceeded the stopping boundary for this adverse outcome. So researchers found that the overall health risks basically exceeded the benefits. And what actually happened during this time was, this is what made the headlines. So here's all of the headlines that you're seeing from 2002. And the negative results of this study received wide publicity. And we saw a lot of panic among people that were using hormone replacement therapy, patients as well as doctors alike. And it was clear from the media that the benefits of HRT maybe were not outweighing the risks here. And so right at this time, the HRT level of prescribing HRT, the use of it declined by half in the United States. So we can see here that we're going to talk about some reanalysis of this study that actually ends up happening. And what we see is that even though these things are happening, the message from the general population hasn't really changed. There's still a lot of fear here. And the estrogen-only data that was published in 2006, this didn't make the headlines. So we see no increased risk of breast cancer with estrogen alone. So that was published a few years later. Still, we have a lot of fear happening. And then we also see that, this study that just, pretty recent, 2019 came out. This also was a more complex reevaluation of that data, and it was published in 2019. And that also didn't really make big headlines. So it's clear that estrogen is protective of what we see to women's hearts and brains and bones and breast, and that many risk factors in the development of breast cancer. But when it comes to estrogen, it doesn't seem to be estrogen itself that's driving breast cancer risk. So when we think about, what is it? Well, it's a study here, this is called the Jenica study, and this can give us some clues. Looking at different variables within premenopausal women, what they noticed was that women that had an elevated 4-hydroxy estradiol, those elevated levels had a higher risk of breast cancer. And so we start to think, maybe it's not just estrogen alone, estradiol, estrone, those estrogens, but maybe it actually has more to do with some of the metabolism. And here's another study that looked at the preparation of mammary adenocarcinoma. And what they found was that those pieces of tissue that from this, mammary cancer here, the 4-HE2 was about 4 times higher than the 2-hydroxy-E2. And again, we're going to talk all about this, but what we actually can get from this study is that the ratio here is important, and it can be used as a biomarker for detection of more malignant tumors. And then we also see some positive news at the bottom of the study here, where the 4-methoxy estrogens actually be preventative against those oxidative metabolites here, which can cause a little bit more DNA damage. And you see where we're going. Here we see that this was a study conducted on 3 prospective studies and utilizing liquid chromatography, double mass spec. And that's actually the same technology that Dr. Stata uses for their urinary metabolites. But you see here that that's demonstrated that the 2-hydroxylation of the parent estrogens, and that means estrone or estradiol, it's associated with a reduced risk of postmenopausal breast cancer here. So we are starting to see a little bit more targeted, looking specifically at more of the metabolites that seem to be bringing forward a little bit more of a picture of the estrogen cascade. And so we also see here that there is a member of the cytochrome P450 family, 1B1, and that's also implicated in the development of the progression of estrogen-mediated tumors. And that's the 4OH. So it's due to this overexpression that it might be responsible for that conversion of more of the estrogens into those toxic metabolites. So it seems, the answer to the question, what is it? It seems that we are more, leaning towards favorable metabolism. So we're going to talk about that. And just a little housekeeping so that we're all on the same page when I start to show reports. I want to introduce you to or review just very quickly the HUMAP here. So the HUMAP, or the Hormone and Urinary Assessment Profile, this provides an overview of the steroid hormones and their metabolites, as well as information on helpful enzymes that would metabolize these hormones. Now, this is a non-invasive test. You're going to see it's a liquid collection. It's either 4 or 5 separate collections. And then, I would say the medium of urine, you're going to be able to see influences from other organs or organ systems within the body, so heavily relying on liver. So liver health will become important. And we'll think about body burden of, other maybe metabolic disorders that might pop up on this. Some oxidative stress will be highlighted here. So it's going to give us a good overall view of what's happening. Now, I will say that the urinary test gives you information on estrogens, progesterones, corticoids, androgens. Today, we are just focusing on estrogens and their association with breast cancer. The helpful thing for you to remember is that there is a color code. So when I'm talking about something, if you're curious about levels, just remember that when we are looking at a glance here, you're going to see there's a little key at the bottom, but that darker blue is going to be below the reference interval. That light blue is low range, but it's still within the reference interval, just in the bottom 10%, so more of a functional range. Our green is going to be optimal within range. We're going to see a yellow, which is, again, top 10%, still within the reference interval, but in the top 10% of that reference. And then you're going to see above the reference interval as red. So as we're kind of moving through, you'll also see this as well, whether their levels are trending high or low. And this is the area of focus here Again, as you can see, this is the steroid cascade in full, subdivided into different neighborhoods, but we are just going to focus on what's underneath our little square here. So again, I like to think of the hormone cascade as little neighborhoods. And so here we are in the estrogen neighborhood. So estrogens are made by aromatizing androgens, and they can go through phase 1 metabolism, phase 2 metabolism, of course. And remember that, when we're thinking about that, we're also looking at COMT as an enzyme of that methylation activity. And we're going to be able to look here for things for potential damage, as well as metabolism of hormones, both endogenous and exogenous. So here we see, a little snippet of what we can see on the report. We will look at each one of these phases specifically, and then we can also see a little snippet of the pathway and the percentage of 2, 4, and 16 are those first phase metabolites we're going to talk about in relationship to each other. And then we also have several methylation ratios to look at, as well as some other ratios to be helpful for breast health. So this is all going to be highlighted within that estrogen section. Now, let's dive into some more of the clinical thoughts behind what's happening here and what we want to test and how we can start to treat. Here are the key enzymes that we're going to focus on. Notice that they're all part of the CYP family. We're going to see 1A1, 1B1, and 3A4 coming up. We're going to start with aromatase. So this is our big one here. So I removed the colors from this example. This is just going to be really easy to pay attention to what's happening here. But when we were looking at androstenedione to estrone and testosterone to estradiol, you'll see that it's aromatase that's converting these enzymes here. Now, you will see in this little square a little way to downregulate, which would be the minus sign, and or potentially upregulate, the plus sign, for aromatase activity. And what we want to think about here is, possible most of the time we are going to want to be downregulating aromatase activity. And that's due to potentially the increase of endogenous estrogens. And remember, that may only be a factor for breast cancer when we're thinking about potential for metabolism. We might have a little bit more estrogen, but it's how is it favoring metabolism? So what we know in general is that to upregulate this enzyme, we naturally could have things like, inflammation, of course, excess fatty tissues. We'll typically see that, maybe some obesity. You could also see that with severe stress, xenobiotics and those types of things. So reducing those things naturally is going to be something that we think about. And then when we're also thinking about our next steps, we're going to be thinking about phase 1 and phase 2 metabolism here. So again, this is a bigger picture for our phase 1 and phase 2. And phase 1, what do we mean by that? Well, we have estrogens, primarily are estrone and estradiol, and these hormones are fat soluble, and they're made from cholesterol. And we all know that oil and water don't mix. So urine is a watery substance, and therefore the fat hormones have to be conjugated in water to be soluble. So you get a little side arm here that allows it to be excreted. So hydroxylation by the hepatic CYP inactivates the steroids and creates this polarity within that watery solution. So you're going to see that phase 1 detoxification, they're responsible for the breakdown of those fat-soluble components. Now, I also want to point out that we're going to talk about some things happening in phase 1. And phase 1 metabolism has while we're breaking down these fatty components, it also has potential to create oxidative damage within the cell system because the results of the formation of reactive intermediates. So this is where, antioxidants might come in, and they're super important. And we can also think about where phase 2 is also important to remove those more harmful intermediates. All right, so when we think of phase 1 metabolites across the board, let's think about more like these live wires, right? Phase 1 metabolites are reactive, and they can cause a little bit of damage. Now, hydroxylation in phase 1 is going to yield 3 metabolites. You're going to see 2OH, E1, and E2, and this is going to be considered more of a safer metabolite. This is going to be, we'll talk about, the pathway it comes down, but it's 1A1. 4OH, this is considered more of a damaging potential. It's less safe. It's 1B1. And we'll talk about that one. And then we have another intermediate here, a 16-OHE1. And, the DNA damage potential is there. It's just less so than 4. Now, when we think about, why is it important that we're, thinking about, CYP1B1, I alluded to this, but when estradiol and estrone are hydroxylated by this, they will form CYP1B1. They form 4OH metabolites. So that's 4OH E1, E2. And when these are not sufficiently methylated, these are what leads to the DNA damage, contributing to an increase in breast cancer risk. These are the 2 images here. Again, just plain removed the color coding here, but if you can look on the left-hand side, you're going to see that CYP1A1 feeds into the 2OH pathway, and CYP1B1 feeds into the 4OH pathway. Now, a little way to think about this that can be helpful if either you're new to this or you want to explain to patients always like really simple things to think about. How about this mnemonic? That CYP1A1, that A is awesome, and B1, B is bad. Well, nothing is really inherently, bad, I would say, in physiology. But when it comes to this unique example, let's just think about awesome versus bad. Now, CYP1A1. So this is the enzyme that pushes, estrone and estradiol into the 2OH pathway. Again, considered more of a safer pathway. And we have, be mindful that there are other things moving through these CYP enzymes, right? We have some polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons can move through this pathway. So other things are happening outside of just estrogens. But when we are utilizing this pathway with our estrogens, it is the preferred pathway. You see here where we have what can upregulate or downregulate this enzyme. That could be really helpful for you to think of as we're moving through cases. And here's it all listed out here. This is kind of everything we would see that would downregulate a CYP1A1. So this would be something that we don't want as much of. We don't want to downregulate CYP1A1. We'll typically see that we want to upregulate this enzyme. And most of the time, I would say we're reaching for things like DIM or I3C can be helpful, or resveratrol with this enzyme. Although, as you see from this list, there are a multitude of things that can upregulate a 1A1. We will think about probably the most studied supplement that you could think of would be this diindol methane. And this is shown to enhance the hydroxylation of 2-estrogen, or the 2-hydroxylation pathway, which has some anti-inflammatory effects in hormone-responsive cell lines. And then it's also been shown to significantly increase levels of 2OH itself. So kind of a double bonus here. The influence of DIM has also been shown to reduce the production of that carcinogenic 4-hydroxy E1. So again, some modulation is happening here and increased levels of CYP1A1 with DIM. When we think about CYP1B1, remember this is more of the bad, right? This is more negative pathway. This pushes the 4 pathway. It actually can enhance the promotion of cancer-causing compounds, and it's more readily found in tumor tissues, as we find, than it is than compared to normal tissue. So this is typically something that we are trying to avoid upregulating. There are things here that could upregulate it. I like to think about inflammation and insulin resistance as those things to attack in my patient population the most. I would also say things like cannabis, if that's in your patient population and this is a pathway they're favoring. There are some things that we can do as far as diet and lifestyle that will be helpful in modulating this pathway. And when you can think about downregulating the pathway, big things that come to mind here are, anything in that Apiaceae family. We have a list here. Resveratrol comes to mind for me. It's pretty easily to get, lycopene, those types of things. And then quercetin will come up here as well. I think, looking through supplements and looking for specific ingredients can help you. A lot of the formulations for here that are going to be helpful would be things that are higher dose antioxidants. You might have in an antioxidant formula things like resveratrol. So you might want to also think about outside the box. It doesn't just have to be an estrogen detox formula or something when you're looking for supplements. It could be, something as simple as resveratrol. One of my favorite things about this test that I love to compare for retesting, especially, would be the percentage of 2,4 and 16-OH. Again, this is 2,4 and 16-OH1. It's in comparison to each other. And when we're looking here, just for reference, if this is your first time, the dotted line or the hash line there, that's the reference interval. And then the darker gray box within that is going to be thought of as more of the optimal range. So here, for example, we have a patient with upper range, or that yellow 4-OH-E1 to 2-OH is the ratio here. And we have an outside of reference interval high for that 4-OH. And, after utilizing DIM for 6 months, we see that we're able to drop things more into a normal, quote unquote, optimal range for that 4-OH. And outside of CYP1A1 and 1B1, we have CYP3A4. Now, this is a little bit more complicated because estriol, aka 16-OH-E2, is helpful and a safe form of estrogen, while 16-OH-E1 is potentially harmful. And that we have an enzyme CYP3A4, and it will push both. Also, this enzyme is utilized in breaking down of so many other chemicals within the body. It's a lot of medications will come through this as well. You will see here, if we wanted to modulate it, here are some ideas. I generally will think about things here. St. John's wort could upregulate that, or valerian, ginkgo biloba. Sometimes I'll look at a list here and see if my patient's on anything that could be pushing a little bit more harmful pathway. But this one, I would say females in general tend to have higher rates of this activity. Also diabetics. If we wanted to downregulate that, polyphenols, such as flavonoids, you can think about that. Some phytoestrogens might come in here, and other things that can help downregulate that. Again, because this is such a huge enzyme, I'm not typically just targeting this specifically. Many of the things like fruits and vegetables, eating the color of the rainbow, that's going to help with this enzyme as well. Now, let's think about phase 2. So phase 2 is all about breaking compounds down into water-soluble and safer compounds for excretion. So with 2 and 4-OH, remember from phase 1, we have more of the reactive intermediates. These intermediates can then be conjugated, and and will be added either, a compound here like sulfur, glutathione, glucuronic acid, a methyl group. And that's how it's going to be moved out of the system. Now, I will say that when we think about phase 2, this image comes to mind where we're able to take those reactive intermediates and put a little cap on them, so making them inactive. And once our caps are on, if you will, and the covered wires aren't exposed, they're no longer dangerous. We don't see them as hot live wires here. The major enzyme for metabolism here is going to be COMT. COMT moves the reactive phase 1 compounds into those safer phase 2 compounds. And basically, when we think about COMT working, in phase 2, I like to ask myself a question. Are we oxidizing or are we methylating? So when we have methylation, we have an inactivity of our catechol estrogens. It's going to help with solubility and that preparation for excretion. They're stable, they're safe, they're not causing harm to the tissues, and they're exiting the body. However, if we have some sort of oxidation happening, this is where we start to get quinone and semiquinone formation. And that's what leads to potential for DNA damage over time. Now, there are ways to look at this. We can look at the ratio of, 4-methyl metabolites. We can look at the ratios of the two methyl metabolites. And then that will give us a clue between, those three if we have a balance in methylation. Now here, if you look at the image, look at the fourth line down, 2, 4, 16. You'll see it starts with 2-methyl E1. So that COMT methylation activity that's happening here, that's low. So we'd want to support. Next, we see the other methylation activity from the next line is normal, and we see that. I see discrepancy all the time with something being low on one side and normal on the other, and then look low again, dropping in the 4 pathway. And the 4 pathway being a little bit lower methylation here, remember that by this ratio being low, we're favoring that 4-OH, so a little bit more harmful metabolite. So we're going to want to address methylation, of course, here. But looking at the ratios within this space can also be helpful to determine how aggressive we should be treating. We can also think about this little clinical pearl, that our 2-hydroxy estrogens are methylated by COMT at a faster rate than the 4-hydroxy. Therefore, we definitely will see free radicals are more abundantly generated from that 4-hydroxy rather than the 2-hydroxy. And so that could also be a reason that the 4 is a little more potent or DNA damaging here. I also wanted to bring up the point that conjugated equine estrogen, which was used in the WHI study, actually increases breast cancer risk when used in tandem with the medroxyprogesterone acetate. So when paired with certain genetic variants, this also may increase the risk because that 4-hydroxy can't be detoxified here. I always like to give some hopeful news. What we're starting to see in the research, which is unique and emerging, and we've talked a lot about the 4 pathway and its increased risk, but the 2 pathway decreasing risk is pretty interesting here. We also see in emerging therapies for breast cancer is potentially this 2-methoxy estradiol. What they saw was its ability to, apoptotic, anti-proliferative, and also an inhibitor of that epithelial cell proliferation and migration. So there's more to come in the world of metabolites, but we're starting to see things pop up as far as emerging therapies. And again, here is our COMT. We have a little list here of what can downregulate and what can upregulate. Note that most of the things in the downregulation of COMT are going to be related to diet and lifestyle, inflammation, external, factors in that way. One of the things you are going to want to do is support this phase. So supporting this phase, I would say multi-step is important here. We can think about supporting with food. Food alone, I would say might not be the best if we have across the board deficits in COMT, but naturally, cruciferous vegetables, resveratrol, citrus fruits, those things, foods are going to upregulate. And when we think about COMT, we also need to think about cofactors that could also be helpful. I also find, thinking about adding magnesium can be helpful as well. So we'll see those pop up here. We talked about the factors that can downregulate, but I go into to kind of give you all of them here. Again, more of the negative diet and lifestyle activities here, and you'll see just poor diet, maybe an insulin resistance, leptin resistance, those types of things. There's even some SNPs that can happen, something that could be interrupting that SAM-SAW ratio, those types of things. When we think about phase 1 and phase 2, well, we have put our little caps on the end or made our estrogens less reactive. But there's another phase that is really important to talk about, and that is going to be our phase 3 elimination. So once our water-soluble toxins are removed out of the liver and they're released into the bile or blood, from there, toxins are moved into the blood, are filtered through the kidneys, eliminated through urine. Toxins moved into the bile are released into the digestive tract and then bound to your stools and excreted. So as you might guess, the success of this process is only as good as your elimination here. So I'm bringing up the fact that when we are treating and we are hoping to help move things out and metabolize. And we're also thinking about optimizing our elimination. So consider constipation when we are thinking about phase 3 elimination. I'd say that can be an obstacle to cure for sure, and something that we can work on as integrative medicine practitioners as well. Now, why are we thinking about this? Well, are we eliminating or are we recirculating? So this is estrogen's metabolism within our gut. And what we see is that we have our conjugated estrogens can pass right on into our gut for elimination. And we have this naturally occurring enzyme called Beta-Glucuronidase, which, its whole job is to unconjugate estrogens and reabsorb for circulation. Now, I would say high levels of Beta-glucuronidase could mean that we have a little bit more recirculating estrogens happening. And then if you increasing slow gut motility can increase that time for deconjugation. So potentially getting more and more estrogens within the system. So when we think about beta-glucuronidase, it's really important that we think about ways to increase our fiber within the diet. And here's why. This is the gut microbiome here and influences the levels of estrogen and progesterone. The estrobolome is a microbiome of colonic bacteria that induces estrogen metabolism. So proper estrogen metabolism depends on microbial abundance and diversity. Dysbiosis in the gut is associated with that impaired estrogen metabolism. So we want to think about dysbiosis. We want to think about constipation. And I would say any other elimination phase 3 issue that your patient might be having, we want to treat that first. And here's why. We need things to be moving out so we have a place to go. So here we have things like, of course, hydration and fiber. If you needed herbal support, that's here, magnesium, COMT, and elimination support, and then movement as well. You can test for beta-glucuronidase levels in the stool. This is a stool test here. And when it's high, we really have to think about what we want to do here as far as lowering that level. And again, just to show on the left-hand side here, the abundance and diversity. We have low diversity, just kind of showing this dysbiotic picture. And so we'd want to treat that the best we can. This is just a reminder here that diet is how we are going to help our gut bugs to have the most diversity and abundance as possible. We look at the comparison of ultra-processed foods versus those diets that have higher fiber, and that we see that those are able to support a more diverse microbial community. And we also see, as far as breast cancer risk, that when we have those ultra-processed foods, it increases the risk of overall and for breast cancer. Okay, and then when we are looking at beta-glucuronidase activity itself, we want to think about higher activity is going to be associated with that high fat, high protein, and that low soluble fiber diet. Again, ultra processed, so high sugars, that standard American diet will follow here. This is why I think most of the drive is towards organic. Also is because intoxicants can happen here. Antibiotics can drive that a little bit as well. Even grilled or charred meats, you're going to see have carcinogenic potential as well. We want to think about how to decrease our beta-glucuronidase activity. And that would be more of a lower fat, maybe lower meat, higher fiber, vegetarian, or mostly plant-based diet. We really also want to increase inulin. So inulin is going to be that prebiotic fiber that's contained in things that are so delicious, like leeks and asparagus, onions, wheat, garlic, chicory, oats. You see the list here. Those are going to be helpful for, again, modifying that or lowering that beta-glucuronidase activity and setting ourselves up for a little bit more of a healthier diet and here, hopefully lifestyle. I've given you the recommendations for soluble fiber here. We typically will see 8 to 12 grams of fiber per day. I've heard maybe upwards of 30 grams a day potential, and that eating any 30 different plants per week, which is actually really difficult. If you've ever tried to do that, if you haven't, I would say try it. It's even for someone who eats a large amount of plants, it's actually hard to get 30 different plant foods in. Most of the time, we're going to think about increasing or decreasing red meats and fats in the diet and increasing plants. If you have any issues with blood sugar, or I would think, things like oral health and blood sugar, environmental exposures, addressing those things will also help with estrobolome. We want to make sure we have good biodiversity that's happening there, and we will think about lactobacillus species for that. Now, one of the greatest things or the best piece of information I can get from this test, I really appreciate in getting oxidative stress information. And here's why. So when we talk about someone maybe pushing a 4 pathway, which we've kind of talked about, CYP1B1 is bad, or they also have elevated oxidative stress markers, I'm definitely going to treat this patient with a little bit more care and maybe a little bit more raised suspicion for them, depending on their history. Here we see estrogen quinone formation in breast cancer. Here we see that in treatment, increased amounts of, due to those DNA adducts. So this is where, again, knowing that oxidation information can be helpful as well. we'll see that increased amounts of estrogen DNA adducts are found not only in people with several different types of cancers, but also in women at higher risk for breast cancer. So that's indicating that the formation of adducts is on the way to that cancer initiation. Let's talk about, I think about this for oxidative stress and damage, but also in that phase 2, but in the 4 pathway. We have to, resveratrol and NAC are 2 heavy hitters when it comes to this pathway and reducing that ratio of estrogens that can cause DNA damage. So for NAC, they might be just a great low cost and effective way to have some protection, maybe prevent breast cancer, maybe other types of cancer. I listed a study here, and I pulled out the next slide image. If you wanted to look further into resveratrol and NAC, those can be helpful for, again, quinone reduction. And here you see just a diagram of how this is happening. Downregulates 4-OH and 2-OH formation. Both resveratrol and NAC work together to back catechol estrogens out of the adduct forming, giving glutathione transferase or CMT enzyme a second chance. So it kind of, instead of pushing them through into methylation, we'll kind of put them back into phase 1. So it allows a do-over, if you will. Also, you'll see that NAC can work by upregulating glutathione and sulfur transferases as well. So helping to metabolize those things out. There's a little suggestion in literature that resveratrol might also upregulate semiquinone reductase, meaning that if quinones or semiquinones can be formed, it might actually help, break those apart. So pretty interesting that we are starting to discover ways to modulate these and help with excretion of these metabolites. Okay. So again, once we see if there is damage from those more harmful metabolites, we are, thinking about our oxidative damage, how it can occur. This is where our 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine comes in here. And we alluded to it at first, but the sources of that oxidative stress that we are talking about is associated with conditions here. And I always think about inflammation. I think a lot of people have inflammation. It's, sometimes thought of this nebulous thing, but when we think about the underlying, what's happening with inflammation, it's little fires. And of course, we're going to have some oxidative stress from that, which is in this vicious cycle coming, chronic stress or cortisol elevations. You'll see that in people who aren't sleeping. You think about that postmenopausal female and insomnia. There's a list of other things to think about here that are pretty ubiquitous amongst the population of adults. And so this is where we could be also gaining more of that oxidative stress. Again, we're just utilizing this test as, adding one little marker together in one patient's story to determine what's happening as far as risk. When I think about oxidative stress or oxidative damage, the best way to treat this would be to find the cause. Most of the time, I would say practitioners, especially in the alternative medicine world, we are really good at finding that cause. And so, treating that, removing the obstacle to cure. Also thinking about things like antioxidants, anti-inflammatories. There's a pretty good list here. This is not exhaustive, by the way, but, just things to think about when we're thinking about that oxidative damage that could be occurring. Oxidative stress references. I added some here if you would like to go through those so you can understand a little bit more. Okay, I wanted to show you a little bit more about what's happening on this report. So if you see in the red, you see this elevated catechol estrogens, it's high 4-OH percentage, and this methylation that is a little less than optimal here, right? It's blue, it's low. So we have high 4 percentage and a low methylation output. So that's going to increase risk. So this is something that, when you get this report, you can look at right away. It's on the front page. If you have someone with an increased risk and you see this, we're going to want to dive further into the report and see what's happening. Remember that 4 is that riskier pathway. Besides looking at those levels of estrogens, you also want to pay attention to the ratios between the different metabolites. So you'll see 2-hydroxyestrone percentage is optimal. And then this pathway has less potential to lead to DNA damage, where that 4-hydroxy percentage is high. And the fact that the catechol estrogens are high is worsened by that poor methylation activity. Here we see that it's circled there in the blue, so that lower methylation activity there. And we're also going to see, if we look at this patient at the bottom, we have a upper range. So, kind of that yellow, like, hey, we're kind of starting to get into a little bit more harmful damage happening here. So oxidative damage is actually happening. And then we see that mixed with our low methylation. So this is the picture of, we have a higher, more harmful pathway, less methylation happening. And we also have our 4:2 ratio is elevated, and our oxidative stress metabolite is pretty high. So this is someone that you would want to, think about as far as having a little bit more risky a picture here. Okay, so here we have, active breast cancer here. What's happening? We have our CYP1B1 enzyme appears to be working. It's high. We have 4-OH is high. See that red E1? That's 4-OH-E1. And then let's think about our therapeutic goals, right? We want to think about decreasing 4-OH-E1. And then we also want to think about supporting methylation and addressing that oxidative stress. This is a 62-year-old female, and this was collected soon after the patient was diagnosed with breast cancer. There's actually on an aromatase inhibitor. You can see, why we're having things kind of driving down as far as our parent estrogens, in that our phase 1 is favoring a little bit more of the 4, and our methylation is not optimal. It's actually low and or low range. Here's a little picture of what that looks like here. And then again, that percentage, the oxidative stress is high. Here's what we're thinking about after treatment. So changing up the diet. Remember, adding, feeding our gut bugs, really important. We did a little phase 3 Mediterranean diet. Moving over some of the 4 into the 2, we think about DIM. DIM and I3C combination here. There are all kinds of estrogen detox formulations that have sulforaphane and those types of things in it as well. So you can see that. Methylated B vitamins, NAC and resveratrol, and then, thinking about stress reduction for this patient as well. I wanted to show you here, just for the comparison, for a little bit of memory. And we have some shifts that have happened within that 4 pathway. You can see, easily shifted over into the 2 pathway, and we've worked on methylation as well. And here's the change or the difference in what we were able to see with just, again, shifting diet, adding some supplementation, and addressing lifestyle. And we have found a more favorable percentage pathway. 2H has increased. We see that we have been able to nudge a little bit of our methylation into more optimal window. Still have some ways to go here, but we are mostly in the optimal window. And then here's the coolest thing. Looking at ways that we can, use diet and lifestyle here, we actually are able to, within 6 months, reduce the amount of oxidative stress that we have here as well. So, changing risk factors for this patient, and also, thinking about the future for longevity of this patient as well. Okay. I wanted to leave you with some small little take-home points that estrogen metabolism patterns, they can influence breast cancer risk, and understanding that and optimizing is the way that we are going to help with risk assessment and prevention. Effective detoxification begins with ensuring a proper elimination. Remember, gut health is so important when we're thinking about supporting regular bowel habits and microbial balance. When we think about treatment, let's think about phase 3, moving upstream to phase 2, supporting that oxidation and hydroxylation, and then phase 1 with those targeted nutrients and interventions that we had talked about. Typically, I'm thinking about estrogen metabolism. Specifically, phase 1 is also generating those reactive intermediates. And so antioxidants. And then when wanting to compare how is treatment working, where have we gotten to, reevaluating after, somewhere between 3 and 6 months to track the progress and adjust the protocols as well. Most of the patients here are going to be doing some sort of lifestyle modifications, but these are the things that I'm prescribing the most. So I thought I'd kind of highlight these here as well. So you have a list of what to kind of talk about with your patients or be thinking about supplement wise, if you're pulling from that. If you need, there is a reference guide to help support you here. This is going to be, just explanation of the test if you want. This is on the website as well. And here is a really important document. If you don't already have it, please feel free to, you can scan here, find this on the website. But this is going to be a therapeutic, clinical and therapeutic consideration. So this will have all of our wonderful knowledge compiled, all the research that you can see for treatments as far as what could upregulate or downregulate every enzyme that's on the hormone cascade. It is really in-depth. Happy reading. And I also wanted to remind that if you have any questions about results, and I'm part of the clinical education team at Dr. Zeta. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have about testing or when you get results back. How can this is new to this. Can you walk me through? Or I've done this several times, but I'm going to have a really difficult case. We're here to help. And with that, I'm open to taking some questions if there is any time.